everyone, and welcome to another weekly art video. I hope you're having an amazing day wherever you are in the world, and thanks so much for joining me on this one. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing a tutorial on drawing fabric using graphite pencils. I'm going to be sharing my entire process with you, starting with how I create my preliminary sketch or my outline sketch freehand, stemming from a reference photo, must-know tips that will help you recreate proportions and shapes effectively, to how I develop a wide range of values from very light areas to a wide range of midtones to darkest darks, via layering graphite. I'll be explaining all about how I use different drawing pencil grades to help me achieve that wide range of values that is needed for higher levels of realism. And then I'll move on to explaining my techniques that I use for developing that subtle texture. This is a great exercise, not only for those of you who are looking to learn how to draw fabric, but for those of you who are looking to increase or make progress with your drawing skills in general. When I was in art school, I had professors who had me draw fabric over and over again, and there is a reason for that. When you draw fabric, you're not only able to develop these general basic skills for all kinds of artwork, which are your observational skills and your fine motor skills, but you're also able to develop these key skills in areas that are necessary for realism. First of all, you're able to practice discerning between different value areas present throughout that fabric so that you can make them happen in your drawing. Another thing is you also get to practice developing edges instead of outlines. And finally, you're also able to discern between gradual transitions between values as well as sharp defined edges between values. This combination is always going to be present in realism. All right, with all that said, let's go ahead and jump in. If you're just getting started with drawing and sketching, or you've been drawing and sketching for some time, but you're really struggling with arriving at effective proportions and shapes freehand, I would highly recommend preparing a drawing space for yourself in your sketchbook if you're working in your sketchbook, or whatever drawing sheet or paper it is that you're working on. Prepare yourself with a space to draw in that has exactly the same size or the same proportions as your reference image that you're observing while you're sketching. So for me, I have prepared, as you can see, this rectangle in my sketchbook that is 5 by 5 inches by 8 inches. And the image that I'm viewing off my computer screen is also 5 by 5 times 8 inches. This is incredibly important, and it's going to help you with your proportions, your shapes, the angles of your lines, and all of this. In terms of my supplies, I'm going to be using a few different drawing pencil grades, and I have an entire video in which I explain about different drawing pencil grades, why it's helpful to have different drawing pencil grades throughout a drawing process, especially if you're going to be developing any type of shading. I'll make sure to link to that video down below in the text section of this post in case you haven't checked it out. But I'm going to be using 3 different drawing pencil grades. I'm not really looking for super smooth shading. In fact, I'm not going to be bringing in a blending stump. Bringing in different drawing pencil grades is going to help me develop light areas, mid-tone areas, and darkest areas a lot more easily and without having to burnish or press too hard down on my paper. I am not going to be bringing in a blending stump or working on super smooth shading, but I am looking for, mid to higher levels of realism. So we're going to be really focusing on observing different value areas, darkest areas, mid-tone areas, and lightest areas in that reference photo so that we can make those different value areas happen in our drawing and arrive at a sense of three-dimensional form of believable light and shadow. In terms of my other supplies, I have a soft graphite eraser on hand, I have a kneaded eraser, and I also have my Mono Zero eraser, which is a pen eraser or a barrel eraser, which is so handy when it comes to removing excess graphite to pull up highlight areas. I am going to be starting out my sketch with an HB pencil. This is what I'm going to be using to create my preliminary pencil sketch and also to start my shading. Then I'm going to be moving on to a 2B pencil. The graphite from the 2B pencil is slightly softer than the HB. And then from there, I'm going to be moving on to a 4B pencil. The graphite in this 4B pencil is softer than the graphite in the 2B pencil. All right, so this is my HB pencil. I'm going to be starting with this one, and I'm going to be creating my preliminary sketch. Now, what I mean with preliminary sketch is just my outline drawing. I am focusing on getting proportions right, on getting shape right, perspective, whenever that really comes into play. All of those things have to be kind of effective in your preliminary sketch before moving forward to any kind of shading. When it comes to drawing fabric, I am noticing the major lines present there, or what I perceive to be lines, because they're not really lines. They're actually changes in value, not really lines. Some of these planes are facing towards the light, and other planes are facing away from the light, and other planes are somewhere in between. These fabric folds, as they are curving up and down, there are plane changes, which are the sections of fabric that are folding downwards and are farthest away from the light, or are being overlapped by other sections of fabric, and all this. So we really have to perceive whatever it is that we're looking at as being a voluminous three-dimensional structure. If you see things as being flat, then you're going to have trouble arriving at a believable or more realistic drawing or painting. I took this photo in my studio, and the light is hitting this fabric from the upper left. You can see how those planes that are nearest the light or facing towards the light are lighter in value than the planes that are facing away from the light. And then you have portions of fabric that are impeding that light from hitting other sections of fabric. Observe the reference photo for a bit and ask yourself, where are the darkest areas present? Why are those darkest areas happening? Where are the lightest areas present? Why are those areas lightest? Where are the areas of midtones? And really observe the midtone areas, because a lot of beginners have issues with the midtones. If you want a drawing or a painting to look realistic, you need a wide range of values. You need lightest areas, you need a wide range of midtones, and you need darkest dark areas. This fabric present does have a bit of texture, and I will explain how I like subtly developing that hint of texture near the end of the drawing process. So what I am seeing first are the main lines, the major angles that are created by the plane changes because of the fabric folds. And I'm going to be drawing these lines relatively lightly. I'm probably going to be drawing them a little bit darker just so that you can see what I am doing. But I would highly, highly recommend at this point of the process keeping your drawing as flexible as possible. And that requires you drawing lightly. If you don't draw lightly, you're going to have issues erasing. And you want to be able to refine your drawing as you go. So I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to keep your drawing light, especially in the beginning when you're just starting to establish those angles and those shapes. Okay, so these are the first two lines that I see. I noticed that this one starts approximately at the halfway point right here. So that's where I started. I also notice how far down it comes within the image. Does it come down to the halfway point vertically? Does it start in the middle point horizontally? Where does it start? And I'm also noticing the negative areas. And what I mean with negative areas are the areas outside of the fabric. When you're trying to establish proportions and shapes, it's so helpful to notice the negative spaces. Notice the shape created by the negative space. Observe that and try to get that shape in, because that's going to help you get the shapes of the fabric in effectively. I see another line created by another fabric fold, and then gets closer to this as it moves down. I'm not worrying about anything down here until later, until I get my major lines in. Okay, I have another line coming down from here and opening and creating this triangular looking shape. And then down here in the corner, there's another little triangular looking shape created by the negative space outside of the fabric. So these are the major lines that I see, the major fabric folds. I'm continuing to compare my sketch to the reference photo over and over and over again, noticing the angles created by the fabric folds. I will say, I relate fabric more to drawing organic objects, natural objects such as flowers and rocks and things like that. When it comes to things like fabric folds and organic objects, our proportions and even our angles of our lines can be slightly off. And as long as you're still understanding that this is a 3D structure that is being affected by light and all of this, you're probably going to be able to arrive at believable results, especially if after this you move on to developing your shading, acknowledging values present and all that. You're going to be able to develop believable results without being super precise down to the millimeter when it comes to your shapes and your proportions. I do have a video in which I explain the difference between drawing organic objects versus man-made objects. I would recommend checking that out. I'll make sure to link to it down below. So now that I have my major lines, I'm going to be closing these shapes by understanding what's going on here at the bottom. I have a line coming in like this. I'm just noticing those angles. Another one coming in, kind of like that. And then I need to create this other shape. There is this plane change that's quite important here that I might want to add in as a shape before moving forward. This is right here the shape created by the upper plane of this fabric fold that flattens out a little bit as it makes its way up. And I'm gonna erase little line sections that I don't need anymore. I leave lines disconnected for a bit as I am building this up. Just notice major lines and edges present there. Then I have another important line in this bottom edge, kind of like that. So these are what I would consider my major shapes and lines. I do need to add more little shapes and lines down here at the bottom, but if you've checked out any of my past drawing tutorials, you're probably already well aware of how important it is to make your way from general, largest shapes, and go towards specifics. So this is what I would consider the general, the largest. And now I'm gonna be adding in the smaller shapes. Here, I can start with just keep noticing the lines and the angles. That's the loop there. Then there's this shape here. Flattens a little bit at the top. It's not pointy because these here are the upper planes of this fold that are facing towards the light. And then this shape ends somewhere around here. And then this goes in. I'm gonna erase that little line section there that I don't need. I'm refining angles here, completing sections, understanding what is going on even more. Here I am missing a little section of those inner planes that are visible from this vantage point. That section right here, that's going to be important to shade in. There's a slight angle here that I haven't got in. And then there's a portion of the fabric that is very much in shadow here. And bring this down a little and connect that there. The inner planes that are facing away from the light and very much in shadow. I'm going to bring this up a tiny bit. It's a little bit too angled. And then here, what I notice are a couple of distinguishable visual lines. Again with the line, but this is just an expression because again, what we're seeing are not lines, they're value changes. Brought that down a little bit more. The more elements you start adding into your drawing, the more points of comparison you're going to have, the more landmarks you're going to have to compare other shapes and lines with or to. every single time that I add in an extra line or an extra shape, I see everything as a whole, and I am comparing the shapes that I've already added in before to that new shape, to that new line, in terms of size, in terms of location, in terms of angles created. And if I have to take a step back and fix something, I do so before moving forward. Really train yourself to continue comparing and analyzing. Okay, so this is kind of what I see there, cleaning up a little. Another thing that I really want to add in is this very noticeable shadow shape that is right here in this upper part of this triangular shape. So I'm just going to add that in because it's a very distinguishable deep shadow shape, and it's worth mapping out things like this in your preliminary sketch as you're understanding what's going on here. And finally, before moving on to the shading process, I'm just noticing if there are any important kind of differences between my outline sketch and the reference photo that I might want to change. Something that I'm noticing, for example, is that this line is a little bit too high up in my sketch. So I'm going to bring it down a bit. I'm just going to bring this down, and I'm going to erase out those lines so that it's a little bit more similar to the image. Another thing is probably this has to come down a little bit more. And the more you do this, the more your observational skills get developed, the smaller the mistakes you make, and the better you become at noticing those differences that you might want to fix. What else? Moving down from there, I have this triangular shape here. Noticing the negative area right here, the shapes that it creates. There's a little important value change here that I might want to map out. There's a plane change here. And make sure that the lines that you're drawing are light, because in realism, there are no lines, there are no outlines. And as you move on to developing your values and your shading, you want to be able to completely eliminate the look of these lines and outlines. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with my shapes, my proportions, my use of my drawing space. Things are looking pretty good to me. So the last thing that I'm going to be doing before moving on to my shading is I'm going to be taking my kneaded eraser, and I'm just going to be doing gentle tapping over my outline sketch because I want to lighten it even more. You can see the graphite there getting collected on my kneaded eraser as I'm doing my tapping. The lighter my sketch is, the more easily I'm going to be able to completely eliminate the look of these outlines as I am working on my shading and my value development. Let's get started with our shading. I still have my HB pencil in my hand. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to work on the lightest values. I'm going to start laying down my first layer of graphite very lightly. I'm going to make my way from left to right because I'm right-handed. And it's just what's most comfortable for me, but you can certainly make your way from right to left if you want to. And what I am doing here is I am laying down my initial layer of graphite. I'm not pressing down barely at all, and I'm just using my hardest pencil grade that I have chosen for this process to start creating values. And as I am making my way towards the right, I am noticing highlight sections in all of these shapes that I am shading in. So in this one, for example, this upper edge is pretty light. I would say that that is a highlight area. There is also a highlight area right here. I don't have to do this right now, but I'm acknowledging that major highlight area because later on, I'm probably going to want to go in with my kneaded eraser to lift up that excess graphite in that highlight area. I'm noticing these sections because later on it's going to be important to remove excess graphite from those areas. As I am filling in these shapes with my initial light layer of graphite, I am trying my best to keep the pressure uniform so that I don't get any stark looking lines and shapes in these areas that I'm starting to shade in. So you can see how I left that upper section of this fabric fold free of graphite as I am doing this, because that is also a highlight section that I'm able to see in that reference photo. That's the section of the fabric that is facing towards the light and that is receiving plenty of light. So I just did my best to keep that section free of graphite. And if I get any graphite in those areas, I'm just gonna make sure to erase them out later. If you're having issues with filling in shapes with uniform, consistent pressure, practice those exercises that I shared in that shading exercise video. Those are very, very helpful. And I'm trying to keep my pencil strokes consistent as well in terms of angle that I'm using. But honestly, the angle is not as important as keeping your pressure consistent, because I can start going like this, and I will later. But what's most important is keeping your pressure consistent, because that is what's going to avoid you creating very stark looking lines and shapes as you're doing your layering with graphite. So I see this major shadow area that I've mapped out for myself here. There is no issue if I go over that with this first layer of graphite, because I'm going to be doing plenty of layering with my different pencil grades in sections of shadow. So I'm just going to go right over that, and I'm just going to keep noticing major highlight areas that I want to avoid adding too much graphite in. This is a shadow section that I can cover up. I'm going to go right in. I'm going to make my way down here, go into these shadow sections because they're all pretty dark. I'm going to do this shape here. I'm going to avoid as much as possible going into these sections here because the planes are facing towards the light in those areas. I'm going to continue filling in this large shape on the right because I see midtones in all this area. All right, so this is what I would refer to as my first layer of graphite. It's the lightest layer. It was created with the same pencil grade that I used for my preliminary pencil sketch. And all I did was I basically filled up everything except for major highlight sections that I'm able to perceive in that reference photo, which are here. The fabric is starting to face towards the light a little bit in this section. I see a major highlight section right here. I see a major highlight section here, and here along the edge, and a little bit down here. And there is absolutely no issue if you got some of your graphite, especially this harder pencil grade, in those highlight sections, because you can very easily go in with your kneaded eraser or something like this, or even a regular eraser. Just use one of the edges of it, make sure that it's clean. But throughout this process, I will be doing plenty of lifting of excess graphite and cleaning up the highlight section. So there is no issue if you got a little bit of that graphite in there. What's important here is that you acknowledge that you will be having to lift up that graphite to create those lightest values. And now it's going to be time to move on to the softest pencil grade that you have chosen for this process. For me, it's going to be a 4B pencil. And what I'm going to be doing with this 4B pencil is I'm going to be starting to develop the darkest value shapes. So where do I see those darkest values in that reference photo? I'm not exerting very much pressure at all. In fact, the pressure that I'm using is kind of the same as what I was using with my first pencil grade. And that's the beauty of using different drawing pencil grades, that you can very easily start creating darker areas, lighter areas, just by changing between your pencil grades. And you don't have to start exerting too much pressure. I try to avoid that because when you start burnishing your paper or scratching your paper, that paper just doesn't take on the graphite the same way, because you have essentially flattened out the tooth of the paper, and it just doesn't take on the graphite the same way and all the layering that we still need to do. If you want to start pressing down harder in the later stages of this process, then fine, you can do that later. But right now we're just working on those initial layers, and it's just important to maintain the integrity of the paper intact as much as possible, especially in these stages of the process. You can see how I've darkened that deep shadow shape right there. I also see a little bit of darkness right here in this opposite edge of this shape. So I am adding a little bit of a darker value here along this edge. There's a little bit of a shadow. This entire section is deeper, so I'm trying to get in major shadow shapes there. Not finalized, but just starting to develop them. A little bit of a darker shadow shape here in this section that is facing away from the light. And a little bit down here. Continuing to observe that reference photo along the way. I'm observing the reference photo probably 60% of the entire time that I am working on the drawing. I'm looking at the reference. I also see a very dark shadow shape in here, and I'm acknowledging all of these shapes as abstract, irregular shadow shapes. See a dark shadow shape here, and then down here. And then there's a loop here. Creates a triangular looking shape. And then down here, there's also a shadow shape because this is the inner planes of the fabric that are facing away from the light. And this entire shape is really in shadow. So I will be darkening more sections later. Then there's a little bit of a darker value here as well. These planes are also facing away from the light, so it makes sense that there would be a little bit of darker mid-tone shapes over here. And then I'm just going to do a little bit of shading here. And I think that's all I'm going to be doing with my softest pencil grade for now. So by this point of the process, I've already started to develop a range of values. I have lightest highlight sections where I have that paper shining through completely or almost completely, uncovered with any graphite. I've started developing lighter value sections where I just created that initial very light layer with my hardest pencil grade. And I've started developing darker mid-tone areas, especially in the darkest shadow shapes that I'm able to see in that reference photo. There's still a lot to do here. I still need to work on midtones, and then I'm gonna be pushing darker value areas even more. I'm gonna go to my medium pencil grade that I have chosen for this process, which in my case is going to be a 2B pencil. And with this 2B pencil, I'm gonna be working on transitions and midtones a little bit more. What I mean is, in between darker value shapes and lighter value shapes, I need a mid-tone. And I'm going to start going in and creating this bridge tone or this middle value, and even using this medium pencil grade that I have chosen for this process to darken some sections even more. Darken some sections that are not really dark as shadow shapes, but they're not as light as I have them right now. Lots of people struggle with the midtones, and if you do, what I would recommend doing is working off black and white photos. Why black and white photos? Because when you see a full color photo, you see all of these different colors in all of these different values. Every single color in a full color photo is present in that image in a wide range of values. So let's just say that you see greens and blues and reds and oranges in all of these different values. And when you're working off a black and white photo, all of those different colors have been unified and compressed into one single scale that goes from white to black or black to white. So instead of seeing this wide range of colors, you just see white, you see grays, and you see black for your darkest areas. And it's just a lot easier for you to start developing your ability for pinpointing different value sections in that way, instead of right away working from full color reference photos. Okay, so I'm gonna do another layer with the same pencil. Even though I'm not going for super smooth shading with this drawing, I am getting rid of some of the sketchiness by doing a second layer over that one, just making sure that I'm keeping the pressure very uniform. And if you're looking for a smoother look without bringing in a blending stump, aside from making sure that you're going in with a consistent, uniform pressure throughout the area that you're shading in, try to go in an opposite angle or a different direction of pencil stroke, opposite or different in angle to the angle that you were using when you were laying down that first layer of graphite in that area. Doing my best to avoid doing too much layering of graphite in lighter value sections. Just doing more layering with this medium pencil grade in sections that need to be darkened a little bit more. They're not super light value areas. They're kind of a mid-tone, lighter mid-tone, and also working on transitions between darker values and lighter values. So I'm going to switch on back to my softest pencil grade that I have chosen for this process, which is my 4B. And I'm going to be pushing darkest value areas a little bit more. So I'm going to start here. And by the way, by this point in the process, you're going to have plenty of graphite on your paper. So what I am doing is just this part of my pinky is coming into contact with the paper. I'm really lifting my forearm from my table. Another thing that you can do if you struggle with smudging is place some tracing paper under your hand and you can just move it as you move forward. So I'm going in and darkening darkest shadow sections with my softest pencil grade, doing a little bit more overlapping, and by this point I am starting to press down a tiny bit more. I'm not trying to burnish, but I am starting to press down a little bit more. And as I make my way out from darkest shadow sections, I exert less and less pressure. That is going to help you create a gradual transition between your values. See a little dark section in this edge there, so I just went in and darkened it. Very dark shadow shape here. And very dark shadow shape here. But even in the darkest areas, try to capture the variety in values, even in the darkest areas. There are no solid, blocky, heavy, dark shapes with one consistent value all throughout. That is going to look very heavy and it's going to look very stark and it's not going to look very realistic. So even in the darkest shadow shapes and even in the lightest highlight shapes, there should be a slight range of values even within that. If you leave any large shapes or areas with one single value all throughout, doesn't matter if that value is a light value or a dark value, it's not going to look very realistic. It's going to lead to flatness. Darken this little section here slightly. I'm going to darken this deep shadow shape right here. And a little bit more along this edge. So notice how I didn't go in and create a line or even a rectangle with a consistent thickness from start to finish. That is not going to look very realistic. What I did was I went in and created an abstract, irregular shadow shape along the edge with a lot of irregularity throughout it, with a value change throughout it. That is going to look a lot more realistic. And hopefully by this point in the process, you can already start seeing how my preliminary outline sketch is starting to disappear. And it's going to disappear more and more the more I push forward with this. I'm going to darken just a little bit of this edge here. And a little bit of this edge here, just a tiny bit there because the light is hitting this section. All right. Darkening a bit, and it's all about continuing to observe the reference photo and asking yourself, is this section darker or lighter than this section over here? What is my drawing lacking? I am lacking a sense of dimension here. There is a fabric fold here that I'm not achieving. What values do I need to develop to transmit those plane changes? Am I missing lighter values? Am I missing darker values? What am I lacking in my drawing that is visible in that reference photo? So I'm continuing to do layering with my 4B very lightly, and I'm only pressing down a little bit harder in darkest shadow sections. I'm going back to my medium pencil grade, which is my 2B pencil, and I'm going to work on transitions a little bit more. Are there any sections that need to be darkened a little bit more where it wouldn't make sense to go in with your softest pencil grade because those sections are not super dark? If so, go into those sections to do more work with your medium pencil grade, not with your softest pencil grade. Save your softest pencil grade for darkest shadow areas. And if you need to work on midtones or transitions between darkest value areas and lightest value areas, use your medium pencil grade. Here, for example, I need a little bit of a light value along this edge of this curve. This isn't so light. So depending on the value that you're trying to create, you're going to be shifting and changing between two different variables. The pencil grade that you have on your hand should make sense with the value that you're trying to develop. And also within the use of each pencil grade, you can alter and shift and change the pressure that you're exerting with that pencil. So within each pencil grade, you can press down a tiny bit more, a tiny bit less, exert more or less pressure if you're making your way out of lighter value areas or into lighter value areas. Make sure that you are changing your tools that you have in your hand, depending on what it is that you're trying to do, as well as how you are using the tool that you have in your hand in order to communicate those values. When you are working on higher levels of realism, it's all about staying patient, and it's all about observing, and it's all about constantly comparing your drawing with the reference photo over and over and over again. The moment that we stop looking at the reference photo and we start just doing things too fast, that's when we start making mistakes that snowball that are then going to be very difficult to fix. All right, so I've managed to develop a wide range of values there. I have little sections where there is still paper shining through that I have kept protected, that I have avoided placing any graphite in because those are major highlight areas that I see. I have, by this point, a wide range of midtones from very light value areas to darker midtone areas and kind of soft transitions in between. And I have very dark value areas that I'm going to be pushing more a little bit later. By this point in the process, you can already see how the majority of my preliminary sketch has already disappeared. And with what I'm going to be doing next, these lines are going to disappear even further. One thing that I do want to point out is how helpful fabric studies are, because not only do they help us really discern between different value areas so that we can make them happen in our drawing, which value really is number one for creating a sense of depth on the page or on the canvas. So being able to tell different value areas in order to make them happen in a drawing or a painting is so incredibly important. If you're going for any level of realism, value is number one. But aside from that, another thing that is so important when you're trying to develop a believable drawing is being able to tell where there are sharp changes between values and where there are gradual transitions or lost edges between value shapes. In a realism, there is always going to be a combination of these two things. And so it's very important to develop that ability to capture those subtleties, those subtle changes in values, and also to be able to tell where there are sharp changes between values and where there are more gradual changes. So just as an example, in this very deep shadow shape here, in the reference photo, there is a very distinctive change between that dark value and the lighter midtones around it, the lighter values around it. Whereas in this section here, values change a lot more gradually. And also, for example, in this big section here, there are value changes within this. It's not a flat value. And we need to be able to observe where those value changes are happening so that, again, we don't leave a large section with one flat value, which is going to flatten out the entire drawing. What I'm going to be moving on to doing now is I'm going to be adding a darker value in this entire negative space here and in this little corner over here. And for this, because this is a very dark value shape, I'm going to be using my 4B pencil, which is my softest pencil grade. I'm going to change directions here because this is too hard to keep going in that direction with that same motion. I'm going to be adding 2 layers of graphite in the negative space, so that will help me get rid of some of that sketchy texture. Doing my best to keep my forearm lifted from my paper. Don't want to start smudging things. I'm going to fill in this corner here. And I'm going to do another layer just to get rid of some of the sketchiness present. So starting here at the top again, making sure that I'm using a consistent pressure throughout my layering of graphite. I went into a highlight shape right there. I'll make sure to, I went into my highlight shape a little bit there. I'll make sure to erase that out in just a bit. And hopefully you can see how, even though I'm not going for super smooth shading or hyper realism, I am able to achieve higher levels of realism just by capturing the values. And also how I'm able to get rid of a lot of that sketchiness that I've left behind through just making sure that I'm layering on graphite with a consistent pressure. I'm also not holding my pencil from very close to the tip and trying to go in with just the tip of my pencil. I'm holding my pencil from higher up, and this is something that I also talk about in another video where I talk about different ways to hold a pencil for drawing. I'll make sure to link to that down below as well. But it's so important to learn how to hold your pencil effectively for drawing in order to have more control over your pencil and be able to stay away from stark looking lines and marks when you're doing something like this. All right, so that's my background filled in. You can see how by this point I have completely eliminated the look of outlines because the few lines that were still visible along the edges, especially where I have those brightest highlight shapes, have now disappeared because I've added in that value in the background outside of the object or the subject. I'm now going to go in with my Mono Zero eraser and I'm going to do some cleanup in my highlight sections. So right here, for example, I went in with some graphite. I'm going to erase that up, clean up this edge a little. And we have to be careful when we're using something like this or when we're going in with a kneaded eraser and pulling up graphite in a shape that ends up looking like a line, because what we need to remember is that not only can we create lines and marks with pencil, but we can also create lines and marks with our erasers. And we don't want to create lines and marks that are super stark looking with either our pencils or our erasers. Noticing little sections of highlights in the reference that I need to clean up. I'm going to clean up this edge. All right, so after having done all this work, I am comparing my drawing with the reference photo once again and noticing if sections need to be darkened. I definitely think that I need to work on darker midtones a little bit more. So because I'm going to be working on midtones, I go in with my medium pencil grade, which is my 2B. And I'm just going to be darkening sections, focusing on the darker midtones. Don't think this section here needs to be that light. I'm going to darken it a tiny bit. Light layering if I want to push certain sections a tiny bit more. Exert a little bit more pressure. If I want to create a little bit of a darker midtone. Work on transitions. Observing and comparing. I think I can darken this a little. So I'm going to go in with my darkest pencil grade one last time, and then we're going to be working on the texture. So 4B pencil, I'm going to be pushing darkest areas a little bit more. Now with a tiny bit more pressure, really not burnishing, but allowing myself to push down a tiny bit harder this time. Abstract irregular shadow shapes, remember that. I think I need to do a tiny bit of lifting right here. I need to develop a slight range of values in that area. All of that is not equally dark. And here as well, can do a little bit of lifting of graphite. Little lifting there. Looking at everything as a whole. Noticing if there's anything too stark. Any important thing that I might need to change. Just Just adding another extra layer in the outer sections, darkening that up a little bit more, maybe evening out that texture, and we're gonna get started with the fabric texture. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with my value development all throughout the fabric. If I need to do a little final cleanup of highlight sections, I can go in with my kneaded eraser or my Mono Zero eraser to clean those highlights up. And it's time to get started with the actual texture of the fabric. Texture follows form. So I wouldn't even start thinking of texture or smaller little details or patterns on the fabric until I am happy with the sense of 3D-ness, if you will, that I have created in my drawing. And when I do add in texture, I do so in a subtle way. There is no need to fill up the entire fabric with texture, and I do like making my way incrementally with it and only adding a little bit at a time and making sure that it is quite subtle. And before jumping in, I do want to make the distinction between patterns in fabric, such as this one that I am sharing with you on screen right now, versus texture present in the fabric. Sometimes there are both. And sometimes it's just going to be one or another. This fabric that I am sharing with you on screen right now, it has a pattern, but it doesn't have much texture to it. If I were to run my hand over this fabric with my eyes closed, it would feel completely smooth. There is no texture present there really. There is a change in color and a pattern in shape if I were to open my eyes, but there is no actual texture there. It's pretty smooth. Whereas the fabric that I am drawing today in this tutorial, it doesn't have much of a visible, distinctive pattern created by shapes that are changing color and a very organized pattern in that way. You could see these as lines if you want to, but there is a lot of irregularity throughout them. There is irregularity in color. There is no specific distance between them. This fabric that I'm drawing today mostly has tactile texture to it. The texture that if I were to close my eyes and run my hand over it, I would actually feel little grooves and little sections of threads popping out. But there is no specific regular organized pattern there made up of shapes. So if I were to create a drawing of fabric that has a pattern but no texture, then I would just approach those as shapes of different colors that I am adding in on this macro level base structure that I've already developed. I would just draw in all of these shapes, of course following the folds in the fabric, and develop darker or lighter values inside of these shapes depending on the color of those shapes. When it comes to texture though, I approach that with lines and marks that are going to help me describe that texture. So in this case, with this fabric that I am drawing today, I decide to use kind of elongated scribbles to help me describe that texture. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with my HB pencil, and what's so important to have in mind when it comes to this type of texture present in this fabric, it's kind of contour lines that are following the fabric and the fabric folds and the planes that we've been understanding, right, as we've been shading this in. What I mean by this is if I start adding in a bit of a line texture here, this is my HB pencil, I'm going to make sure that I'm observing and understanding how the fabric curves in that section. Subtly, I am starting to add in those lines, and how I'm not going in and drawing a perfect line. I'm actually just kind of scribbling the texture in and adding that quote unquote line in segments. So I'm not starting the line here and ending it here with one consistent line. I'm actually tackling this in sections that are not even connecting in some points. Don't draw straight lines because that's not what's going on here. We have curves created by fabric folds, and these quote-unquote lines that you're creating for the texture, they have to follow those curves. If you go in with straight lines, you're going to flatten out your drawing. And I'm making sure that there is a lot of irregularity in these lines and marks that I am creating because Any consistent visible pattern is not going to look very realistic, not when it comes to a texture like this. And so we want to think of irregularity in every sense of the word, and variety and subtlety. Variety in terms of how visible these little lines and marks are. Variety in how I'm placing them within these shapes. So some of them are more separate than others. Some of them are closer together. Variety in the scribbles and marks that I am using to communicate these visual lines. Variety in terms of everything. We'll be adding some more of these in with softer pencil grades in just a bit, but I did want to make sure to start with my hardest pencil grade, which is my HB pencil. As I said, I want to go from light to dark. I want to make my way incrementally towards the more visible lines and marks. So this is already more than enough. And hopefully you can see how the line that I created, if you were to see this as a line, is following the curve of the fabric. But within that, there is a lot of irregularity, and there will be more as I move on to using my softer pencil grades. So if I were to create these quote unquote lines here, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to make sure that I understand the fabric fold and that I'm not mindlessly starting to just add lines and marks. That's more than enough for that area. Very subtle. Especially with the sections of highlights where you don't have much graphite in there or a very light value developed, you don't want to go in with super dark looking lines and marks. Keep them subtle in those areas, because if you go in on a light value with a dark value line or mark, that is going to create a lot of contrast and it's going to be very, very stark looking. So with those lightest value sections, I'm probably not going to go in with my softest pencil grade. I'm going to keep them super light in those areas. Now moving on to this shape here, there is a curve. And I'm just using gentle scribbling motions, lifting up the tip of my pencil in certain sections and making sure that some of these lines are closer together and some of them are farther apart. And these are just little marks that I'm adding. It's nothing more. When it comes to fabric texture, curve here and then go down, curve here and then go down. You're going to see all kinds of different textures in fabric. And it's really going to come down to practicing how to draw that specific texture. Doing texture studies is super, super helpful. Textures such as wood or metal, different types of fabrics, so that you can have tools and tricks up your sleeve and little techniques that you can use when it comes time to creating a drawing. And when it comes to texture, it's going to come down to different lines and marks that communicate that texture. There are combinations of different lines and marks that you kind of repeat with irregularity, of course, within that repetition. It's just going to come down to seeing which lines and marks can help you better describe that texture. However, within all textures, there has to be a lot of variety and irregularity if you want them to look believable, that is. And of course, always remember that texture follows form. If you haven't arrived at a believable look with that overall macro level structure, the folds, the nooks, the crannies created by the fabric folds themselves, no amount of detail or texture is going to make that fabric look believable. Value creates that believable sense of three-dimensionality of fabric folds, and I would see texture as a detail that should be added over that macro level structure that you've created. And if you're looking to specifically improve your textures, what I would recommend is working on texture studies. isolated texture studies that you do in your sketchbook or on a separate drawing paper, aside from your actual full piece, where you're working on utilizing different combinations of lines and marks to help you describe different textures. What I like doing is I create separate squares in my sketchbook. I find good close-up reference photos of different textures, whether it be wood, fur, metal, whatever the case may be that I want to practice. I spend time observing the characteristics that make that surface or that material distinctive from others. I pick specific lines and marks that I think are going to help me describe that texture, and I work on it. I'm going to move on to my 2B pencil, which is slightly softer than the pencil grade that I was just using. And with this one, I'm just going to go over certain sections of some of these marks that I've already added in, which is going to help me emphasize more of that irregularity and variety that I was just talking about. Because these lines and marks that I add in with my softer pencil grade are going to look slightly darker than the lines and marks that I was creating with my previous pencil grade. And this is going to add to that variety in value or tone in these lines and marks, which is going to make it look a lot more natural. Noticing curves and changes in planes that create changes in those lines and marks. These really are just scribbles, elongated scribbles. Loosen up your wrist. Went a little overboard with that mark there. I'm going to erase that up. Go in with my HB pencil. Fill that section up with graphite again. Go in with my 2B pencil, just fix that area. All right, I don't think I need to go in with my softest pencil grade. I think this is already more than enough visual texture to communicate the characteristics in that fabric. So I'm pretty much done here. That little mark is a little bit distracting for me, so I'm going to make it less visible by just tapping over it with my kneaded eraser. I'm gonna go in to fix that, starting with my HB pencil, filling in that section that I just erased up, going in with my next pencil grade. So if you ever need to fix something and you need to erase a section up, first of all, don't go in and erase the entire thing with this eraser. I would recommend actually going in with a kneaded eraser and just doing gentle tapping to make that marker line or shape less noticeable. And then start back up, filling in that section with graphite and developing values in that area, starting with your hardest pencil grade and making your way incrementally towards the softer pencil grade as needed. Add in a few texture lines here. Darken a little section more here. Any final things that you might need to darken in a general sense. Final pushing of darkest dark areas with my softest pencil grade. And with that, I'm all done with this fabric study. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did, and if so, make sure to check out everything that I'm offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you're going to get immediate access to my exclusive tutorials, classes, and resources that I don't share anywhere else. All of these exclusive tutorials include my downloadable outline sketches so that you don't have to start from scratch, reference photos, and my supply lists. There's already a library of over 75 sketching and watercolor painting tutorials that are real-time, meaning they are not sped up or edited, they are fully narrated, and I take you through my entire process, making sure to explain everything as clearly as possible, step by step. 2 new exclusive full-length tutorials are added into this exclusive library every single month. For those of you who are interested in really taking your artwork to the next level and want to know all of the inside secrets that I learned about in art school and courses that I've invested in myself, there's also a full library on classes on art fundamentals in which all of the bases are covered. That library has now over 35 classes and workshops, all have assignments at the end that help you actually put your knowledge to the test. And there's a brand new class or workshop added at the beginning of every single month. As if all of this weren't enough, you also get a weekly sketchbook prompt sent to your inbox to help you stay consistent with your art practice. There's a live training, workshop, or paint-along session with me every single month. Members in the $15 tier and upwards get access to thorough feedback from me on their work whenever they need it, and much, much more. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, which you can choose from depending on your goals and needs. So go ahead and check it out. I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can find out more down below in the description box of this video. And I would love, love, love to get to know more about you and your work and have you join this innermost art community of mine. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.